So today I'm going to be talking about fear, diving into our discomfort zones and ultimately facing ourselves. So in this photo, I was about 2 meters from a cliff edge and absolutely terrified. Growing up, heights was my biggest fear. And this next photo was my worst nightmare. Today I'm going to share my story of coming from that scared girl on the cliff to being able to walk this high line today. And while I'm talking, I want all of you to think of a fear you're facing. Day in and day out, what are you hiding from? What are you distracting yourself from? What are you scared to face? This was the first time I faced my fear. It was about a 10-15 meter cliff, and instead of getting close to the edge and having a panic attack and breakdown, I decided to jump off of it, into water, of course. And it was in this moment where I realized I didn't have to be a product of my fear. I could walk forward in the presence of it. And I decided to start climbing, because I didn't want to just face my fear momentarily. I wanted to face it constantly. And if anyone knows anything about climbing, the higher you go, or the more you climb, the higher you go. So for someone who's scared of heights, this is terrifying. And so I had to keep saying yes in the face of all those no's yelling at me inside. And I kept pushing my limits, or what I saw as my limits. That's us really high up in the corner if you can't see. I kept pushing higher and deeper into those fears. And when I faced those limits, I realized that those limits were kind of disappearing underneath my feet. They didn't exist in the first place. And I noticed also while I was climbing that fear never goes away. In our lives, in our day-to-day, we're always running from these fears. It's always there. It's just in that decision if you choose to let it control you or not. So as I kind of dived into these fears, well, little by little, it kind of opened up in different areas of my life. And I began to go on long camping trips alone out in the mountains. And one thing led to another, and I was going on 2-month camping trips in pretty remote parts of the world. And a lot of times I was a lone female. Doing climbing expeditions and not showering much. And so I think in 3 years, I spent most of my time in a tent, caves, dirt, you name it. And I was planning a trip to Patagonia around this time to kind of push that comfort zone again. And I got the worst call of my life. My dad in blue had died in a sudden car accident, and it crushed me to pieces. My dad was one of my biggest inspirations in life. And he really instilled this love for nature in me, as well as this will to never give up. I pushed through this time, and I was like, I need to, go through with what my dad had taught me to not give up. And so I still went to Patagonia a few months later. And there was a moment on this trip, on our first summit. It was a really big summit. And I broke down on the side of a cliff and just started bawling. I remember my friends looking at me and being like, Kaleigh, if you don't get up and go, we're not going to make this summit we've waited a month for. I didn't get up. I was there stuck for almost an hour, just completely overtaken by fear and grief. And at some point, I remember looking up and deciding to take one step forward and then another step forward. And I realized in those moments how capable we are as humans. In my climbing, I saw these people highlining sometimes. And I was like, oh, that's next level. No way can I do that. Climbing, you're facing a cliff. Highlining, you're walking into the abyss. Until, again, I had a moment where I decided, okay, maybe I can try this. I remember sitting on my first high line and looking at the ground, having a panic attack and getting off. And this repeated itself a lot of times until I decided in a moment again to try getting up, try walking it. And I fell into the abyss immediately. Absolutely terrifying. But I probably took about 500 falls until I started actually walking. And I think this is a good metaphor for life. We don't have to be afraid of the falls. Oftentimes I think that fear that, what I mentioned at the beginning, we're afraid of the failure, the worst possible outcome. Well, what if we looked at that as more of a stepping stone in the process rather than a failure? And soon after highlining, I started paragliding. I wanted to push myself more. And just earlier this year, I got asked to go on an expedition to Jordan, a very remote part of Jordan. And you can see us here, ready to take off. Immediately I said no. That's way above my head, not for me. And I thought, okay, why am I saying no? And a couple weeks later, I called them back and said yes. I was saying no out of fear. So the next photo is my first takeoff. We had been climbing for 8 hours, gotten to the summit, and we didn't know many people who'd actually flown off this before. And my friends immediately took off. They were psyched. I froze. I was up there for 3 hours contemplating, can I do this, can I not do this? And at some moment, remembering all the other times, I decided to move forward, to fly. And I guess all these experiences taught me that change starts with ourselves. If we want to impact the world, we have to not be afraid to look inside ourselves. So through this, I decided to start a project called Wild Her. And Wild Her guides women in the wilderness to find their whys in life. If you would have asked or told this scared little girl, not little girl, I guess, but scared girl on the cliff 5 years ago, that she would have been one of the first women to go climbing and flying in this remote part of Jordan, I would have laughed at you. No way. Or speaking to you right now. And I want you to think back on your fear that you thought of in the beginning of the speech. What is it that you're hiding from in life? What is it that you're scared to face and turn into? Because I think it's in these moments where your thoughts cease to exist, where you're paralyzed in instinctual fear, but are fighting fiercely to control it. It's in these moments that you discover both the most vulnerable and the most powerful parts of yourself. These are the moments that push you beyond yourself and make you come alive. Thank you.